Senator from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I want to thank Senator Fisher for all of her work on the Senate Armed Services Committee and so many other areas. I'm here to talk about the same subject, the National Defense Authorization Act. It may be difficult to understand the difference between appropriating and authorizing. We've got two different sorts of committees here. One focuses on the resources, authorizing their use, but they cannot be used, or I should say funding their use, but they can't be used unless they're authorized. So every year for 58 years, we've come into the committee, we've heard differing opinions on priorities, but at the end of the day, the amazing thing about the Senate Armed Services Committee when it comes to the National Defense Authorization Act, we always reach a bipartisan agreement, and it passed out of the Senate Armed Services Committee with, I believe, unanimous support. Then it got passed out of the Senate. And normally this happens in the June timeframe, maybe July timeframe. Now here we are in November. Not only have we not passed the National Defense Authorization Act, but we're at risk of passing anything. Now what we're hearing about is the so-called skinny bill that would just be the basic authorities while we're leaving everything else on the table. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Personnel Subcommittee, which is what I chair, but what do authorities mean? It means research on new weapon systems. It means research for men and women in a dangerous situation to make sure the best possible technology and training is available to make it as safe as it can be in an unsafe environment. There are hundreds of authorizations in the National Defense Authorization Act that are at risk of sliding another year for the first time in 58 years. Now what I want to talk about is what's at stake if we can't reach an agreement with Speaker Pelosi, specifically in the Personnel Subcommittee. I actually requested the Personnel Subcommittee because I wanted to focus on the business of the Department of Defense, and I wanted to focus on military families and on the soldiers' health and safety. If we do not pass provisions that passed out of my subcommittee and that was in the National Defense Authorization Act that passed out of the Senate, here's what's at stake. A pay raise for every soldier, sailor, and Marine, a 3.1% pay raise. They could lose this year as a result of not gaining agreement with the Senate. We have a lot of provisions in there for military housing. I'm from North Carolina. And we have two very large installations in North Carolina, Fort Bragg, the home of the Global Response Force, and Camp Lejeune, the home to a bigger population of Marines than any military installation in the world. They're in housing today that needs to be upfitted. They're in housing that, quite honestly, is in many cases unsafe. This National Defense Authorization Act makes progress to make sure that the families that are housed on bases are in safe, clean settings. And quite honestly, in some cases, they're not today, which is why we got bipartisan support for the provisions we put into our subcommittee, Mark. Another thing that we're working on, and it's very difficult for someone who doesn't come from a military background, is to understand how challenging it is for a spouse to get a job for the brief period of time that they may be in a military installation or another. This, Mark, has provisions in it to make sure that military spouses get employment opportunities as quickly as possible and to cut through a lot of the red tape that they're dealing with today. That provision's at risk. We've also taken major steps in trying to prevent or reduce military sexual assault. Provisions in this bill, I am convinced, because they were voted out on a bipartisan basis, are at risk because we can't seem to get agreement with Speaker Pelosi's House. Another very important area in places like North Carolina. North Carolina at Camp Lejeune alone experienced over $3.5 billion in damage as a result of our most recent hurricane. And Fort Bragg is still trying to recover from a hurricane that happened about 2.5 years ago. There are authorities in there to make sure that we can rebuild these facilities, military housing as well as offices and other training facilities at Camp Lejeune could slip another year if we allow what I think right now is the impasse between the House and the Senate to move forward. These are all very, very important provisions in the National Defense Authorization Act. These are all provisions that got bipartisan support from this body. And if you all have been watching Congress, you know that we have our disagreements, and there are certain things that we just simply aren't going to see eye to eye on, but we see eye to eye on the National Defense Authorization Act. That's why I don't understand why the House will not come to the table and pass something that we have successfully passed for every year of my life. I'm 59 years old. This could be the first time in 58 years that we run the risk of not showing the respect that I think the men and women in military and uniform deserve, to give them the authorities to be trained properly, to not run the risk of working with old authorities that could diminish training and readiness and capabilities. This is about these folks that have sworn to defend the Constitution and our freedom, and we can't take the time to bridge the gap and eliminate the other reasons that divide us and at least come together on something that for 58 years we've seen our way clear to passing and making progress for men and women in uniform, for soldiers, sailors, and Marines, and for their families. So I implore the Speaker of the House and the members of the House to come to terms and pass what we have done successfully for decades. We owe it to the men and women of uniform, and we owe it to every American to understand what's at stake if we all of a sudden slide for a year while our adversaries continue to gain ground. So I hope that my colleagues will continue to come together and pass this bipartisan legislation. It's within reach and absolutely an expectation, I think, of every member of Congress to show our men and women in uniform respect by doing our job. Thank you, Mr. President.